Before the fall, there was a world, and it was more like our world than you might imagine. Close your eyes and travel back 33 centuries to the eastern Mediterranean around the year 1250 BC. Do not picture a primitive age. Picture a connected one. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty rule a kingdom already ancient. The pyramids at Giza are over 1,000 years old, tourist attractions even then, covered in the graffiti of earlier generations. In Anatolia, modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire commands the high plateau from a capital of stone walls and gates guarded by carved lions. In Greece, the Mycenaeans, the people whose distant memory will one day become Homer's heroes, rule from hilltop citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. In Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylon carry on traditions of writing and law already 15 centuries old. And stitched between these giants, along the coasts of the Levant, lies a chain of brilliant merchant cities. Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, the ports through which the whole world trades. And here is the thing that makes this age extraordinary, the thing scholars only fully appreciated in the last few decades. These powers were not isolated worlds. They were a system. They wrote to each other constantly. They traded with each other obsessively. They married into each other's royal houses, sent each other doctors and sculptors, exchanged gifts and insults and threats and gossip. Historians now speak of the Late Bronze Age as the first international age, the first time in human history that a web of great powers rose together, knew each other by name, and depended on one another for survival. We know this because we can read their mail. In 1887, an Egyptian peasant woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of a place called Amarna found a cache of clay tablets, the diplomatic archive of the pharaohs, hundreds of letters between Egypt and every great power of the age, written in Akkadian, the international language of the day, the way English is used today between countries that share no native tongue. The Amarna letters and the archives found later at the Hittite capital and at Ugarit opened a window onto the daily workings of a vanished world order, and what they reveal is startlingly familiar. The kings call each other brother. They complain about the quality of gifts. The king of Babylon writes to Pharaoh that the gold he sent was less than expected and looked debased when put in the furnace. They negotiate royal marriages like corporate mergers, haggling over dowries for years. They complain about delayed messengers, about merchants robbed on the road, about who failed to ask after whose health. The king of Cyprus apologizes for sending so little copper, explaining that plague has struck his land. A Hittite queen writes to Rameses the Great of Egypt about arrangements for her daughter's wedding journey. It is statecraft, commerce, and family gossip braided together, the same braid that runs through diplomacy in every age, including ours. The lifeblood of this world was bronze, and bronze is the key to understanding everything, including the fall. Bronze is not a thing you dig from the ground. It is a recipe, roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. And here was the catch that shaped the entire age. The ingredients came from opposite ends of the known world. Copper came mainly from Cyprus, whose very name became the word for the metal. But tin came from staggering distances. From the mountains of Afghanistan, 3,000 kilometers to the east, carried by caravan and ship through Mesopotamia to the coast, perhaps some from as far as Cornwall in distant Britain. Every sword, every plow fitting, every chariot fitting and temple vessel in the Mediterranean depended on supply lines stretching across the whole of the known world. Think about what that means. The Late Bronze Age was not just connected by choice, it was connected by necessity. No kingdom, however mighty, could make its own weapons without materials from lands it had never seen. The Hittite army marched on Afghan tin. The Egyptian temples shone with Cypriot copper. It was, in the strictest sense, a globalized economy, and like every globalized economy before or since, its strength and its fragility were the same thing wearing two faces. We even have a snapshot of that economy in motion, preserved by catastrophe. In 1982, a Turkish sponge diver working off a headland called Uluburun, near Kaş on the southern coast of Turkey, reported seeing metal biscuits with ears on the seabed. What he had found was a ship, a merchant vessel that sank around 1320 BC and lay undisturbed for 33 centuries. Its excavation took 11 years and over 20,000 dives, and it remains perhaps the greatest archaeological discovery ever made underwater. Cargo was a world in miniature. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of tin from Central Asia, ebony logs from Africa, ivory, whole elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth, amber from the Baltic Sea 2,000 miles to the north, glass ingots colored cobalt blue and turquoise, Canaanite jars filled with terebinth resin for perfume, gold jewelry, including a scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, weapons in Mycenaean, Canaanite, and Italian styles, food, almonds, figs, olives, pomegranates, spices. The personal effects of the crew suggest Canaanite merchants accompanied by Mycenaean officials, different peoples, working a single ship on a circuit that touched a dozen lands. One ship, one ordinary commercial voyage out of thousands like it, caught and frozen by a storm. The Uluburun wreck is the late Bronze Age holding its breath underwater, a single cross-section through a living web of exchange that spanned 3 continents. When you hear that this world fell, this is what fell, not just palaces, but this, the web itself. And we should be honest about the shadows in the Golden Age, because they matter to what comes next. This brilliant world was brilliant mostly at the top. The palaces ran command economies. Scribes recorded the rations of textile workers, many of them women and children, many of them captives, down to the last measure of grain. The countryside fed the citadels and saw little in return. The great powers fought wars that consumed generations. At Kadesh, around 1274 BC, the Egyptians and Hittites collided in the largest chariot battle ever fought, thousands of chariots wheeling on a Syrian plain, a battle both sides claimed to have won, and which settled in the end almost nothing, leading instead to the first surviving peace treaty in world history, a copy of which hangs today in the United Nations building in New York. It was a world of magnificent surfaces stretched over deep strain, palaces dazzling and peasants hungry, trade routes humming and pirates multiplying at their edges, an international order elegant in its letters and exhausted in its provinces. A world, in other words, that looked permanent and was not. No one inside it could see what was coming. The letters of the 1220s and 1210s BC discuss grain shipments and wedding gifts and the price of copper. There is no sense of an ending. There never is. Spend a moment longer inside that golden world, in one of its cities, on an ordinary day, because the texture of what was lost matters. Stand on the quay at Ugarit around 1250 BC in the morning. The harbor is loud in 4 languages at once. A ship from Cyprus is unloading copper ingots shaped like ox hides, each one a man's load. Beside it, a coaster from the Egyptian delta discharges linen and gold and papyrus, and takes on cedar logs and jars of wine. Customs scribes move along the quay with damp clay tablets, recording duties. Ugarit taxed everything smoothly and famously, and everyone paid because everyone profited. In the merchant quarter behind the harbor, the great trading houses keep archives in 5 scripts. A single family firm might write to Cyprus in Akkadian, to the Hittite court in Hittite, and to its own warehouse in the local alphabetic cuneiform. 30 signs, one of humanity's first alphabets, invented here in this city by people who needed bookkeeping more than they needed monuments. Up the hill, the palace runs like a corporation. Treaties are sworn and sealed. A princess from a neighboring kingdom arrives with her dowry inventory down to the last bronze mirror. Ambassadors wait in courtyards with gifts and grievances. In the temple quarter, priests of Baal sing liturgies that will be excavated 3,000 years later and found in places to share whole images and phrases with the Hebrew Psalms not yet written. In the scribble schools, boys copy the classics of 3 civilizations: Mesopotamian wisdom, Hurrian hymns, local epic, and the literature of Ugarit, dug from the ash, will one day rewrite the scholarly understanding of the entire ancient Near East. This is what was humming on the coast that morning: finance, multilingual literacy, international law, religious poetry, customs bureaucracy, marine insurance in all but name. Then hold the other image beside it, the same key, a lifetime later. Burned warehouses open to the sky, arrowheads in the streets, the archives baking in the ruins, and the harbor silting up, year by year, with no one left to dredge it. The distance between those 2 mornings is about 60 years, less than a single long human life. That is how fast a world can go. The end, when it came from the sea, or so it seemed to the people standing on the shore. The dating is approximate, as all Bronze Age dating is, but the window is narrow, between roughly 1,200 and 1,150 BC, within a single human lifetime. Nearly every great power of the Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed, crippled, or transformed beyond recognition. Archaeologists, sifting the rubble 100 generations later, found the same layer in city after city: ash. Let us take the roll call slowly, the way the catastrophe took it. Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, a city of temples and archives on the Anatolian plateau, seat of an empire that had treated with Egypt as an equal, burned. Its great buildings show evidence of evacuation before destruction. The official archives were partly emptied, the sacred images removed, as if the state itself packed what mattered and walked out the gates before the fire came. The empire that had stood for 500 years did not retreat or shrink. It vanished so completely that within a few centuries no one remembered it had existed. When the Hebrew Bible mentioned Hittites, later scholars assumed they were a minor local tribe. The rediscovery of a forgotten superpower in the 20th century, from the decipherment of its buried archives, remains one of the great resurrections in the history of archaeology. Mycenaean Turins, Pylos, the palace civilization of Greece, the world of golden masks and cyclopean walls, destroyed in waves between roughly 1,250 and 1,180 BC. At Pylos, on the eve of its destruction, the palace scribes were recording, on clay tablets in the script we call linear B, emergency dispositions. Watchers posted to the coast, rowers levied for the fleet, bronze requisitioned from the temples. The tablets were never meant to survive. They were temporary records, and the fire that destroyed the palace baked them hard and preserved them forever. The last documents of Mycenaean Greece are the minutes of an emergency. And with the palaces died writing itself. Linear B was a palace technology used by trained scribes for palace bookkeeping, and when the palaces burned, the knowledge burned with them. For the next 3 to 4 centuries, Greece would be illiterate. The civilization that would one day produce Plato forgot how to write, and when writing returned centuries later, it would be a different script entirely, borrowed from Phoenician traders. Between the two literacies lies the gulf we call the Greek Dark Age, and on the far side of that gulf, the burned citadels had transformed into legend. Golden Mycenae, rich in gold, remembered by poets who no longer knew it had kept spreadsheets. But it is at Ugarit, the great merchant city on the Syrian coast, that the catastrophe left its most haunting record, because at Ugarit the end arrived mid-sentence. Ugarit was the Hong Kong of the Bronze Age, not a great military power but a great commercial one, fluent in every language, banker and broker to all sides. Its archives, dug from the ruins, include the correspondence of its final months, and reading them in sequence is like watching a ship's instruments record its own sinking. The king of Ugarit, Amurapi, writes to the king of Cyprus, the famous letter found in the ruins. Listen to it. These are the actual words 3,200 years old. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. All my troops are away. All my ships are away. The country is abandoned to itself. Ugarit's forces had been sent to help its overlord, the Hittite king, against an enemy pressing from another direction, and while the soldiers were gone, the ships came. 7 ships. That is all it took to begin the end of a city that had stood for over 1,000 years. 7 ships, arriving at an undefended coast, at exactly the moment the system's defenses were committed elsewhere. Another tablet from the Hittite court had earlier demanded grain from Ugarit, a shipment described as a matter of life and death. Famine then in the Hittite heartland before the fires. And one final detail that archaeology has given us, almost too perfect in its sorrow. Some of Ugarit's last tablets are said to have been found in the kiln where they were being baked for dispatch. Letters finished, fired, and never sent, because the city died around them. Whether or not every detail of that famous image survives scholarly scrutiny, the larger fact does. The correspondence simply stops. The city was burned, thoroughly and violently, with arrowheads scattered in its streets, and unlike almost every other destroyed city of every other age, Ugarit was never reoccupied. The site stayed empty for 3,000 years, a ghost with its mail still in its hands. Down the coast, the destruction rolled south. City after city in the Levant burned. And then it reached the one great power that would survive and write down what it saw. In Egypt, the pharaoh Ramesses III met the storm head-on. On the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, in the longest hieroglyphic inscription known, he recorded the crisis in words that historians have been quoting ever since, because they describe from the inside the fall of the whole system. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on being cut off at one time. They were coming forward toward Egypt while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denian, and Weshesh, lands united. No land could stand before their arms. There it is, the contemporary verdict. Hatti, the Hittites gone, Alashia, Cyprus gone, Carchemish, Arzawa gone. The Egyptians named the attackers as a confederation of peoples, and on the temple walls they carved their portraits, warriors in feathered headdresses and horned helmets, arriving not as an army but as a migration, ox carts piled with belongings, women and children riding among the fighters. Whoever they were not merely raiding, they were moving, they had brought their families, they were looking for somewhere to live. Ramesses met them in the Nile Delta, on water and on land. In battles his artists rendered as a chaos of capsizing ships and drowning men, and Egypt won. The invasion was stopped. The pharaoh's account drips with triumph. Those who reached my frontier, their seed is not. But read the fine print of the following decades and the victory rings hollow. Egypt survived the battle and lost the world. The trade networks were gone. The partners were ash. The treasury emptied. In the reign of Rameses III himself came the first recorded labor strike in human history. The royal tomb builders of Deir el-Medina laying down their tools because the grain rations had failed. "We are hungry," they said, 18 days into the month. The pharaoh who saved Egypt was later murdered in a palace conspiracy, the throat cutting confirmed by a CT scan of his mummy 3,000 years later. Within a few generations, Egypt had lost its empire and entered its own long twilight. The last great power standing had won the war and inherited the ruin. Before we leave the ruins, walk through 2 more of them, because each adds a brushstroke the big picture needs. Pylos first, on the western coast of Greece. The palace of sandy Pylos, as Homer would remember it, home of wise old Nestor in the epics. Its destruction gives us the most intimate archive of the catastrophe outside Ugarit, and a strange gift of fire. The heat that destroyed the palace baked its temporary clay records into permanence. Reading them in sequence is chilling in a quiet, administrative way. Watchers are guarding the coast, says one series, and the tablets enumerate them. Hundreds of men posted in detachments along the shoreline, watching for something expected from the sea. Rowers are levied for the fleet. Bronze is requisitioned, temple bronze. The tablets specify sacred objects sent to the forges, which is the Bronze Age equivalent of melting down the church bells, a measure governments take only at the edge of the abyss. There is even a tablet debated by scholars for decades that may record extraordinary sacrifices, offerings of gold vessels, and on some readings human beings made in the palace's final days. Whether or not that darkest reading is right, the sequence ends the same way in every interpretation. The watchers watched, the rowers rowed, the bronze was gathered, and the palace burned anyway, with the tablets still in their baskets. Then Hattusa, the Hittite capital, because its end breaks the pattern in a way that matters. The great city on the plateau did not fall to a storm from the sea. The sea peoples never reached central Anatolia. Hattusa starved and withered first. The empire's final correspondence is obsessed with grain. "Ship it now," says one royal letter about a consignment. It is a matter of life or death. The Hittite state, master of the plateau for 5 centuries, had become dependent on imported food moving through ports like Ugarit. When the coast caught fire, the lifeline burned with it. The capital's final layer tells an eerie story. The royal archives partly emptied, the cult images gone, the great buildings burned but burned, many archaeologists believe after abandonment. The court appears to have evacuated, packed the gods and the tablets that mattered and walked away into history's fog. We genuinely do not know where the last king went. The city the empire left behind was torched, perhaps by the highland tribes who had circled it for centuries, perhaps by its own hungry hinterland. A superpower did not die in battle. It dissolved, and the wind took the rest. 2 ends, then, among the dozens. One city watching the sea for a blow it could see coming and could not stop. One empire bleeding out invisibly, far from any coast, through the severed arteries of trade. The catastrophe did not need to reach you to kill you. That is what it means for a system to fail rather than a city. The wave that destroyed Hattusa never touched its walls. So who killed the Bronze Age? For over a century, the prime suspects were the obvious ones, the sea peoples themselves, the horned-helmeted raiders of the Egyptian reliefs. The 19th century scholars who coined the name imagined a barbarian wave sweeping out of the unknown and smashing civilization, a Mediterranean prequel to the fall of Rome. It is a satisfying story. It has one significant problem. No one can find where the wave came from, because it seems to have come from everywhere, and from inside. Take the names from the Medinet Habu inscription and follow them, as generations of scholars have. The Peliset, almost universally identified with the Philistines, who settled the coast of Canaan immediately after the catastrophe, and whose earliest pottery is, unmistakably, Mycenaean Greek in style. They made Aegean cooking pots, used Aegean hearths and Aegean weaving weights. The people remembered by the Bible as Israel's archetypal enemy appear to have been, at least in part, refugees from the collapsing Greek world. The Shekelesh and Shurden names that scholars have long connected, cautiously, with Sicily and Sardinia. The Denian possibly connected with the Danuna of Cilicia, or some have ventured with Homer's own word for the Greeks, the Danons. The Lucca Lycians from the coast of Anatolia itself. Look at that list again. Greeks, Sicilians, Sardinians, Anatolians. These are not outsiders from beyond the map. These are insiders, peoples of the Bronze Age Mediterranean itself, peoples who had been the system's sailors and mercenaries and traders for centuries. The Shurden, in fact, appear in Egyptian records generations before the collapse, as pirates first, then as the pharaoh's own elite bodyguard. The Lucca appear in the Amarna letters as sea raiders a full century before the fall. The sea peoples were not an invasion of the system. They were the system, coming apart, taking up arms, taking to the sea with their families in the ox carts behind them. Which transforms the question. If the attackers were refugees and breakaway populations from inside the Mediterranean world, then they are not the cause of the collapse. They are a symptom of it. Something had already gone wrong, something that turned sailors into raiders and farmers into migrants across half a dozen lands at once. The sea peoples did not kill the Bronze Age. The dying Bronze Age created the sea peoples. So the investigation turns to deeper suspects, and the first of them is the sky. For decades, drought was a hypothesis in this case. In the last 20 years, it has become evidence. Scientists drilling sediment cores from lake beds and lagoons in Cyprus, Syria, and Galilee, analyzing fossil pollen grain by grain, found the signature of a catastrophic dry period beginning around 1200 BC. A megadrought, lasting not years but decades, perhaps as long as 300 years at varying intensity, spanning the entire eastern Mediterranean. Tree rings from Anatolia agree. Isotope studies from cave formations agree. Around the time the cities burn, the rain simply fails across the whole system at once. And the tablets had been telling us all along. The Hittite demands for emergency grain, a matter of life and death. An Egyptian pharaoh shipping grain north to keep alive the land of Hatti charity between superpowers, unthinkable in a normal century. A letter from Imar on the Euphrates in its final years, recording parents selling their children for grain. Famine is everywhere in the last archives, once you know to look for it. The Golden Age was starving before it burned. Add the earth to the sky, the seismologist's contribution. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a lattice of fault lines, and the geophysicist Amos Nur demonstrated that the destructions cluster suspiciously along them, proposing an earthquake storm, a decades-long cascade of major quakes unzipping the region's faults one after another, as documented in the modern era on Turkey's North Anatolian Fault. Several of the destroyed cities show the fingerprints, crushed skeletons under fallen walls, walls offset sideways, toppled column rows all lying the same direction. Not every burned city was shaken, but some were shaken, then burned. Yet no single suspect can carry the verdict alone, and this is where the case becomes genuinely profound. Droughts had happened before, earthquakes had happened before, raiders had always existed. The Bronze Age system had absorbed all of them repeatedly for centuries. That was what the web was for. Grain could be shipped to a stricken partner. A burned port could be rebuilt with a neighbor's timber and copper. The system was resilient, until suddenly it wasn't. The explanation that most scholars now favor, argued most influentially by the archaeologist Eric Klein, whose book on the year 1177 reframed the whole debate, is that the cause was not any single blow but the combination, striking a system whose interconnection had become its vulnerability. They call it systems collapse, and it works like this. The drought cuts harvests everywhere at once, so no one has surplus to share. Hunger sets populations moving. Moving populations disrupt the trade routes. Disrupted trade cuts the tin and copper supply. Without bronze, states cannot equip the armies that protect the trade routes, and every failure feeds the next failure. The palaces, those centralized command economies, depend on the flow continuing. When the flow stops, they cannot pay the scribes and the soldiers, and the periphery stops obeying the center. Pirates multiply at the system's frayed edges. Each city that falls adds its own refugees to the wave breaking on the next city. The network that once distributed strength now distributes failure faster and faster, until in a single lifetime the whole web is down. A globalized world dependent on long supply chains, hit by climate change, mass migration, war, and institutional failure all at once, and discovering that its connectivity, the very thing that made it rich, was the mechanism of its destruction. If that sentence raises the hair on your arms a little, you are not alone. Every historian who works on 1177 BC eventually says some version of the same thing. The more carefully you study the first collapse of civilization, the more familiar it becomes. There is one more suspect to interview, and it is the one the rubble whispers about, the people of the kingdoms themselves. Look closely at the destruction layers of the Mycenaean citadels, and a pattern emerges that foreign invasion explains poorly. At several sites, what burns first or burns most thoroughly is the palace itself. The archive rooms, the throne rooms, the storehouses of the ruling order, while humbler districts sometimes carry on, diminished but alive in the ruins. No new foreign culture arrives to claim the smoking citadels. No sea peoples settle in Greece. The pottery after the fall is the same people's pottery, made poorer. Some archaeologists read in this the oldest story of all, revolt. The palace economies were extraction machines. The tablets themselves document the rations of dependent laborers measured to the gram, and machines like that run on the consent that prosperity buys. Take away the prosperity, fail the harvests, cut the trade, raise the levies for coast watchers and fleets, and the men with bronze in their hands may decide, one bad year, that the palace is the problem. The linear B tablets of Pylos record the perimeter being guarded against the sea. Perhaps the fatal blow came up the hill from the villages instead. We cannot prove it. Burned beams do not testify about who held the torch, but the system's collapse model has room, even need, for this darkest gear: internal breakdown. Famine becomes flight, flight becomes raiding, but famine also becomes fury, and the same drought that launched the boats could light the citadels from within. The sea peoples of the Egyptian reliefs and the rebels of the Greek hills may be two faces of a single phenomenon, a generation, all across the Mediterranean, that stopped believing the old order could feed them, and tore it down from outside and inside at once. And one final, modern footnote to the investigation. In 2024 and the years around it, scientists added a literal timestamp to the chaos. Radiocarbon work and tree ring studies kept sharpening the drought's profile, and DNA studies of remains from the period began mapping the movements of actual people, confirming, in the bones themselves, an age of unprecedented mobility around 1200 BC. The case of the Bronze Age collapse is that rare thing, a 3,000-year-old cold case where the evidence is still improving. Every few years, a lake bed or a laboratory adds a line to the file. The verdict, systems collapse, all suspects guilty, acting in concert, has only grown stronger. And because this is a story about a system, give the survivors their chapter 2, the ones who rode the wave instead of drowning in it. Not everything fell. Assyria, inland on the Tigris, battened down and endured, and would return centuries later as the iron-armed superpower of the New Age. Egypt, as we saw, bent without breaking and in bending, recorded everything, becoming the catastrophe as official witness. Cyprus, struck hard, recovered with strange speed. Within a generation, its towns were working iron and trading again, as if the island had read the new rules first. And on the Levantine coast, in the cities the wave somehow spared Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. The survivors inherited the entire vacated network. Within 2 centuries, these Phoenicians, sailing alone where convoys once went, had rebuilt the Mediterranean economy in a new image. Not an empire of palaces, but a web of harbors. Not royal gift exchange between brother kings, but something much closer to private commerce. The collapse did not just destroy a world order. It selected the next one leaner, more mobile, more mercantile, and the Mediterranean of the Greeks and the Phoenicians, the sea of colonies and coinage and alphabets, was built by the firms that survived the crash. Historians of later ages would recognize the pattern because it repeats. After Rome, after the Black Death, after every systemic fall, the same sequence: contraction, dark age, then renewal along new lines, led by the margins rather than the old centers. The late Bronze Age collapse is simply the first full performance of a play that history has staged again and again. The first time the lights went out on a connected world, and the first proof that they come back on. Changed. What follows the end of the world? Morning eventually, but first a long night. The centuries after 1177 BC are the original Dark Age, the one the term was invented for, long before it was applied to anything medieval. The archaeology of the aftermath is an archaeology of absence. Settlements in Greece drop in number by perhaps 3/4. Those that survive shrink to villages huddling in the ruins of citadels. The great palace at Mycenae is squatted by people who patch its walls with rubble. Long-distance trade contracts to a trickle. Monumental building stops. Art forgets perspective and ambition. The swaggering bulls and griffins of the palace frescoes give way to simple geometric lines painted on pots. And writing, across the entire Aegean, goes silent for centuries. Think about what that silence means humanly. There were generations, whole lifetimes, grandparents and grandchildren, who lived in the shadow of cyclopean walls they could not have built, walls so massive that later Greeks decided giants must have made them. The memory of the Golden Age survived only as story, retold and burnished around fires, growing stranger and grander with each retelling, until 3 or 4 centuries later, a poet or a tradition of poets we call Homer wove those inherited memories into the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Trojan War, whatever kernel of Bronze Age reality lies inside it, reaches us as the dream a dark age dreamed about the golden age it had lost. Western literature begins as an act of remembering a collapsed world. And yet, and this is the turn the story takes, the turn that collapsed stories always seem to take, the Dark Age was also a womb. Consider what the catastrophe cleared away: an international order of palaces and god-kings, of command economies and scribble monopolies that had organized the Eastern Mediterranean for half a millennium. When that order fell, everything it had suppressed or centralized came loose, and in the wreckage, the survivors improvised. 3 of those improvisations changed the world permanently. Iron. Bronze had required the great web, copper from one end of the world, tin from the other, palaces to organize the exchange. With the web down, smiths turned in earnest to a metal they had known about but neglected: iron ore, which is found almost everywhere, requiring no caravan from Afghanistan, no royal correspondence, no fleet. The Iron Age was not born of invention so much as of necessity, a democratized metallurgy for a decentralized world. The very names of the ages tell the story. The Bronze Age ends in 1177 fires, and what rises from them is named for the metal of the survivors. The alphabet. The writing systems of the Old World, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, linear B, were professional technologies. Hundreds of signs, years of training, scribble guilds bound to palace and temple. They died or dwindled with their institutions. But in the cities of the Levantine coast, among the traders who survived the storm, a radically simpler idea had been incubating. A script of only a couple of dozen signs, one for each consonant sound, something a merchant could learn, not a priesthood. In the centuries after the collapse, the Phoenicians, the heirs of Ugarit and Byblos and Tyre, carried that alphabet across the Mediterranean on their trading routes. The Greeks took it, added vowels, and wrote down Homer. Nearly every alphabet on earth tonight, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, Arabic, Hebrew, descends from that one lean survivor's script. The collapse killed the writing of kings and handed writing to everyone else. And freedom of a kind, room. With the empires gone, small peoples stepped into history who could never have flourished under the old superpower's shadow. The Phoenicians built a sea-trading network wider than anything the Bronze Age knew, planting colonies as far as Spain and founding Carthage. In the hill country of Canaan, in the power vacuum between fallen Egypt and vanished Hatti, the people who would become Israel emerged, and with them, in time, a religious literature that reshaped half the planet. And in the villages of Dark Age Greece, free of palaces and their god-kings, new forms of community slowly grew that would one day call themselves the polis, the city-state, the seedbed of citizenship itself. It is one of history's deepest ironies. The roots of the classical world, the alphabet, the city-state, the traditions of Greece and Israel, all run down into the ash layer of 1177. Our world was planted in the ruins of theirs, none of which redeems the suffering, and we should not let the long view erase it. For the generations who lived through the fall, there was no consolation in iron or alphabets. There were burned homes, empty granaries, roads full of strangers, children sold for grain, and the kiln at Ugarit with the letters never sent. Collapse looks like renewal only from a very great distance. From inside, it looks like the end of everything, because it is the end of everything that those particular people had built and loved and assumed was permanent. That assumption is the real artifact this story leaves us with. The kings of the Golden Age wrote to each other as brothers in a correspondence they expected to continue forever. The merchants of Ugarit loaded ships for ports they expected to stand forever. The scribes of Pylos pressed their emergency rosters into clay they expected to recycle next season. Permanence is the universal illusion of functioning systems. Every age believes its web is too vast and too necessary to fail, and every age is wrong on a long enough horizon. The Bronze Age happens to be the first time we can watch the illusion form, flourish, and shatter, in the participants' own words. And what of the sea peoples themselves, the names on the temple wall? Their afterlives deserve telling, because they are the strangest epilogue in the file. The Peliset, settled by Egypt or settling themselves on the southern coast of Canaan, became the Philistines of the Bible. 5 cities, Gaza and Ashkelon among them, a people whose Aegean table manners and painted pottery slowly dissolved into the local world until only their name remained. And their name had a career no one could have predicted. The Greeks called their land Palestine. The Romans, after crushing the Jewish revolts, fixed it to the whole province. And so the name of a vanished Bronze Age boat people is spoken every single day, tonight, in the news of the modern world: Palestine. A migration from the catastrophe of 1177 BC is embedded, 3,000 years on, in the daily vocabulary of geopolitics. The Shurden, some scholars hold, gave their name to Sardinia, where Bronze Age towers and statues of horn-helmeted warriors stand to this day, either the raiders' homeland or their retirement. The Shekelesh are linked by the same cautious arguments to Sicily. The Tejeker settled the Canaanite coast at Dor, where a later Egyptian traveler's tale records their port and their piracy. The Denian dissolve into a tangle of names that may include Homer's own word for the Greeks. None of these equations is certain, all are perennial, and that is the point. The Sea Peoples did not exit history. They dissolved into it, into place names, into bloodlines, into other people's epics, the destroyers becoming, within a few generations, simply more ancestors. The wave that broke the old world soaked into the soil of the new one and disappeared. The sites keep their vigil tonight. Hadusa stands silent on its windy plateau in central Turkey, its lion gate guarding an empty city, snow settling on stones that once anchored a superpower no one remembered for 3,000 years. Mycenaean walls still stand above the Argive plain. You can walk through the lion gate at dusk when the tour buses are gone and hear nothing but wind in the dry grass. Ugarit lies under its mound by the Syrian coast, the harbor that received the 7 ships long since silted into farmland. And in the Egyptian desert, on the walls of Medinet Habu, the feathered warriors still surge forward in stone, and Ramesses still stands forever victorious over a world that was already gone. Beneath the Mediterranean, on the seabed off the Turkish coast, the excavated bones of the Uluburun ship rest in the dark, the copper and the tin that never arrived, the wedding gold that was never worn, the almonds and figs of a meal never eaten. A delivery 3,300 years late, from a world that assumed, as we do, that the ships would always come. They are all asleep now, the brother kings and their quarrels over gold, the scribes and their rations, the sailors and the raiders, even the sea peoples themselves, settled and assimilated and dissolved into the nations that came after, their feathered helmets surviving only in stone. The whole connected, brilliant, anxious, doomed world of the late Bronze Age sleeps under its layer of ash, and over the ash, 3,000 years of new worlds have grown, including tonight yours. Civilizations are mortal. That is the hard gift of 1177 BC. But the same record whispers the gentler half of the truth. Collapse is never the end of the story. Something always walks out of the ash, carrying in one hand almost nothing, and in the other the alphabet. Sleep well.